the cold barrel of a shotgun pressed against Virginia Cole's temple as her brother, Emmett, barked instructions to the burly debt collector standing in their small farmhouse kitchen. The year was 1876, and in the unforgiving Colorado Territory, people paid their debts one way or another. "I ain't got the money, Harlow," Emmett slurred, the whiskey on his breath filling the room. "But I got something worth more, my sister. Pretty little thing, ain't she? 20 years old and healthy as a horse. She'll work. She'll do whatever you want." Virginia's eyes widened in horror as realization dawned. The farm had been failing for years, ever since their parents died of cholera. Emmett had taken to gambling and drinking, digging them deeper into debt. But this selling her like cattle, she never imagined he could sink so low. "Emmett, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You can't do this." Her brother wouldn't meet her eyes. "Shut up, Ginny, it's done." Harlow McNally, the notorious debt collector who worked for wealthy ranchers and businessmen throughout the territory, looked Virginia up and down like she was a mare at auction. His smile revealed tobacco-stained teeth. "She'll fetch a good price at Madame Ruby's in Silverton," he concluded. "Might clear half your debt, Cole. The rest you'll still owe with interest." "No." Virginia lunged for the door, but Emmett caught her arm, twisting it behind her back. "You're going, Ginny, one way or another." Tears streamed down her face. "I've worked this land with you for years. I cooked your meals, mended your clothes. How could you?" Emmett shoved her toward Harlow. "Take her, we're square." "Not quite," Harlow growled, gripping Virginia's arm so tightly she gasped in pain. "But it's a start." He dragged her outside to where his wagon waited, forcing her up onto the bench seat and binding her wrists with rough rope. Virginia looked back at the only home she'd ever known, at her brother standing in the doorway, refusing to meet her eyes. "I'll never forgive you for this," she called out, her voice breaking. As Harlow's wagon rattled down the dirt road, Virginia fought against her bindings until her wrists were raw and bleeding. They traveled for hours, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly. Virginia's throat was parched, but Harlow offered no water. Her mind raced with horrible visions of what awaited her at Madame Ruby's brothel. Night was falling when they reached a crossroads tavern. The Broken Spoke was a rough establishment where travelers and locals alike gathered to drink, gamble, and trade news. Harlow pulled the wagon to a stop. "You try to run. I'll hunt you down and make you wish you'd gone to Ruby's," he warned, cutting the rope binding her to the wagon but leaving her wrists tied. "I need a drink and a meal before we continue." Inside, the tavern was crowded with cowboys, miners, and drifters. Harlow pushed Virginia ahead of him, keeping a firm grip on her arm. He found a table in the corner and shoved her into a chair. "2 whiskeys," he called to the barmaid. When the drinks arrived, he pushed one toward Virginia. "Drink. It'll make what's coming easier." "I'd rather die of thirst," she replied, lifting her chin defiantly. Harlow laughed. "Pride won't last long at Ruby's, girl." At a nearby table, a tall man in a black Stetson glanced up from his poker game. He'd noticed them enter. It was hard to miss a beautiful young woman with bound wrists being manhandled by a notorious thug like Harlow McNally. The man laid his cards face down and took a slow drink of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving Virginia's face. His name was Mason Quinn, and he'd been riding the Western Territories for nearly 10 years, working as a ranch hand, occasionally as a deputy when towns needed extra guns, and most recently as a bounty hunter. At 31, his face bore the weathered lines of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors, and a scar running along his jawline hinted at violent encounters in his past. Virginia felt the stranger's gaze and looked up, meeting his eyes briefly before looking away. Something in that steady gaze gave her a flicker of hope, though she quickly extinguished it. Nobody in this God-forsaken place would help her. "McNally," the stranger called out, his voice carrying easily across the tavern. "That's quite a grip you've got on the lady." Harlow's head swiveled toward the voice. "Mind your business, Quinn. This ain't your concern." Mason pushed back from the table, gathering his winnings. "Just wondering what a debt collector is doing with a bound woman. Seems unusual even for you." The tavern grew quieter as patrons sensed the brewing confrontation. Harlow's hand moved to his gun. "She's payment for her brother's debts. Taking her to Silverton. Legal transaction." Mason approached their table, moving with the relaxed confidence of a man who knew how to handle himself. Up close, Virginia could see his eyes were a striking blue, contrasting with his sun-darkened skin. "Don't look legal to me," Mason said casually. He glanced at Virginia. "Madam, are you traveling with this man willingly?" Before she could answer, Harlow cut in. "Don't matter if she's willing. Her brother sold her debt to me. She's my property now." A murmur rippled through the tavern. Even in the rough justice of the frontier, selling a woman was crossing a line for many. "People aren't property, McNally," Mason said, his voice hardening. "Not even to settle a debt." "The law says different when there's a contract," Harlow growled, producing a crumpled paper from his coat. "Signed by her brother. Legal and binding." Mason took the paper, examining it. "This isn't worth the ink wasted on it. No court would uphold selling a person." "No courts out here, Quinn. Just men handling business." Mason folded the paper and slipped it into his own pocket. "How much is the debt?" Harlow's eyes narrowed suspiciously. $200, plus interest and collection fees. $300 total. $400, Mason scoffed. "Highway robbery, $350. Virginia looked between the men, bewildered by this negotiation over her future. "What are you playing at, Quinn?" Harlow demanded. "I'm offering to pay the lady's debt. In full." Virginia's breath caught in her throat. This stranger was offering to buy her freedom. Or was he simply looking to acquire her for himself? Harlow laughed. "You're a fool. She'll fetch twice that at Ruby's over time. But you'd have your money now. No risk, no having to transport an unwilling woman across dangerous territory." Mason pulled out a leather wallet and began counting bills. $375, that's my final offer." The tavern was silent now, everyone watching the standoff. Virginia hardly dared to breathe. After a long moment, Harlow nodded. "Add that bottle of whiskey from your table and she's yours." Mason's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Done." He laid the money on the table along with the bottle. Harlow counted it twice before pocketing it and standing. "Pleasure doing business, Quinn." He smirked at Virginia. "Enjoy your new master, girl. Might find he's not as generous as you think." After Harlow left, Mason sat down across from Virginia. Without a word, he drew a knife and cut the ropes binding her wrists. She rubbed her raw skin, watching him warily. "Thank you," she said cautiously. "But why would you pay so much for a stranger?" Mason flagged down the barmaid. "Water for the lady, please, and some food." He turned back to Virginia. "I didn't pay for you, miss." "Virginia Cole," she supplied. "Miss Cole. I paid your brother's debt. There's a difference." He pushed the folded contract across the table. "This paper is meaningless. You're free to go wherever you please." Virginia stared at him in disbelief. "You spent nearly $400 to free someone you don't even know," Mason shrugged. "I've been saving bounty money." Couldn't think of a better use for it than stopping Harlow from destroying another life. The barmaid brought water and 2 plates of stew. Virginia drank greedily, then set the glass down, studying Mason's face for any hint of deception. "So there are no expectations?" she asked carefully. Mason's expression remained impassive, but his eyes softened. "None. Though I wouldn't advise traveling alone after dark. You're welcome to share my table for dinner, and I can help you find safe accommodation for the night." Virginia's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she picked up her spoon. "I don't know where to go," she admitted quietly. "I can't go back home. Emmett made that clear." "Do you have family elsewhere?" She shook her head. "No one." Mason ate thoughtfully for a moment. "I'm headed to Durango tomorrow, planning to winter there, maybe find work at one of the ranches." "You're welcome to ride along. Town's growing, might be opportunities for a woman looking to start fresh." Virginia considered his offer. This man had just saved her from a fate worse than death, asking nothing in return. Yet traveling with a stranger carried its own risks. Still, what choice did she have? "Why would you help me further?" she asked. Mason met her gaze directly. "Because I've seen what happens to people with no options in this territory. No one should face that alone." There was something in his eyes, not pity but understanding, that made Virginia believe him. She nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Quinn, I accept your offer of safe passage to Durango." "Mason," he corrected gently. "If we're traveling together, we might as well use first names." They finished their meal in surprisingly comfortable silence. Afterward, Mason arranged a room for Virginia at the tavern, paying extra to ensure she would not be disturbed. He took a separate room across the hall. Before retiring, Virginia paused in her doorway. "Mason," she called softly. When he turned, she continued, "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "Live well, Virginia. That's payment enough." With a slight nod, he disappeared into his room. Virginia closed her door and leaned against it, exhausted but no longer terrified. For the first time since Harlow had appeared at their farm that morning, she allowed herself to breathe freely. Whatever tomorrow brought, she was no longer being sold like cattle. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the mountains. Virginia woke early, having slept better than expected. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, a simple blue calico dress, worn but clean, and a shawl that had belonged to her mother. Her few possessions remained at the farm. When she descended to the tavern's main room, Mason was already there, drinking coffee. A bundle sat on the chair beside him. "Morning," he greeted her. "Coffee," she nodded gratefully, sliding into the seat opposite him. The barmaid brought her a steaming cup. "I took the liberty of purchasing a few necessities," Mason said, pushing the bundle toward her. "Nothing fancy, but you'll need something for the journey." Virginia unwrapped the bundle to find a sturdy coat, a woolen scarf, gloves, and a small carpet bag containing basic toiletries, a hairbrush, and a change of clothes. "I had the barmaid help with sizing," he explained when she looked up in surprise. "Hope it's suitable." "It's more than suitable," Virginia replied, genuinely touched. "But you've already spent so much." Mason waved away her concern. "Consider it an investment in your fresh start." After breakfast, they set out for Durango. Mason had a sturdy horse and a pack mule, and Virginia rode behind him, her arms tentatively encircling his waist. The mountain air was invigorating, and despite her uncertain future, Virginia felt a strange sense of freedom. "Have you always lived in Colorado territory?" Mason asked as they rode. "Born and raised," Virginia replied. "My parents came west from Pennsylvania before I was born. They homesteaded our farm, built it from nothing." She sighed. "It broke my heart watching Emmett gamble it away bit by bit after they died. How long have they been gone?" 4 years now. "I was 16 when the cholera took them both within days of each other." Mason was quiet for a moment. "That's a heavy burden for someone so young." "It was harder on Emmett. He tried at first, but the farm was struggling and the drink got hold of him." Her voice hardened. "Still, I never thought he'd sell me to pay his debts." "Some men lose their way so completely they forget what matters," Mason said. "What about you?" Virginia asked. "You mentioned bounty hunting. How does someone end up in that line of work? Mason was silent for so long that Virginia thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I was a deputy in Arizona Territory for a while. Saw too many criminals walk free because no one wanted to track them across territorial lines. Figured someone had to. Sounds dangerous. It can be, but there's satisfaction in bringing in men who think they're above the law. He paused. I've been thinking of settling down, though, getting too old to live constantly on the move. At what age does a man consider himself too old for adventure? Virginia asked, a smile in her voice. Mason chuckled. 31 isn't ancient, I suppose, but 10 years of sleeping under the stars makes a proper bed mighty appealing. They traveled steadily, stopping occasionally to rest the horse. By midday, they'd covered considerable ground. They paused by a small stream to eat the provisions Mason had packed. Virginia sat on a fallen log, watching as he tended to the animals. You're good with them, she observed. Animals are straightforward, he replied. They don't lie or cheat. Treat them well, they do the same. Unlike people. Some people, he corrected. Not all, Virginia nodded, thinking of her brother's betrayal. I trusted Emmett completely. Even when he was drinking and gambling, I never thought he'd. She couldn't finish. Mason sat beside her on the log, maintaining a respectful distance. Trust is hard to rebuild once it's broken, but not impossible. Their eyes met briefly, and Virginia felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. She looked away quickly, focusing on repacking their food supplies. They continued their journey as clouds gathered overhead. By late afternoon, rain threatened, and Mason suggested they seek shelter for the night. An abandoned line shack came into view just as the first heavy drops began to fall. The shack was basic, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough table, and a narrow cot, but it was dry and would protect them from the increasingly violent storm. Mason quickly built a fire while Virginia swept years of dust from the floor and arranged their bedrolls. I'll sleep by the door, Mason said, spreading his blanket on the floor. You don't have to, I insist, he interrupted gently. You take the cot. Outside, lightning cracked and thunder rolled across the mountains. Rain pounded the roof and wind whistled through the cracks in the walls. The fire cast dancing shadows around the small space as they shared a simple dinner. Why Durango? Virginia asked, warming her hands around a tin cup of coffee. It's growing but not overcrowded yet. The Denver and Rio Grande Railway reached it last year, bringing new opportunities. I thought I might find honest work there, maybe save enough to buy some land eventually. What kind of work? Mason shrugged. Ranch work, possibly. I'm handy with horses, or law enforcement again if they need deputies. He glanced at her. What about you? What skills do you have? I can cook, so garden. Nothing special, but I'm a hard worker. She stared into the fire. I never thought about what I'd do if I left the farm. Never had that luxury. Well, now you do, Virginia nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose I do. As the evening wore on, they shared stories from their lives. Mason told her about growing up in Kansas, about his brief time as a cowhand in Texas, about the most peculiar bounties he'd tracked. Virginia spoke of her mother's teachings, of the beautiful quilts they'd made together, of her dreams of someday having her own family to love. When Virginia finally lay down on the cot, exhaustion overcame her, and she fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof and Mason's steady breathing across the room. She woke in the night, disoriented, her heart racing from a nightmare in which Harlow dragged her through endless darkness toward Madame Ruby's. The fire had burned low, casting the shack in shadows. Across the room, Mason sat awake, his back against the wall, watching the door. You should sleep, Virginia whispered. He turned toward her voice. Old habits, I'll rest soon. You always sleep with one eye open, in unfamiliar territory, yes. Virginia sat up, pulling her blanket around her shoulders. I'm sorry if I woke you. Bad dream. Mason nodded, understanding. Want to talk about it? She shook her head. Then do you think Harlow will come after us, after me? Mason considered before answering. I don't think so. He got his money, but if he does, he'll have to come through me first. The simple statement, delivered without bravado, reassured Virginia more than elaborate promises would have. She lay back down, and this time when sleep claimed her, no nightmares followed. The storm passed during the night, and morning brought clear skies. They set out early, hoping to reach Durango by evening. The rain-washed landscape sparkled in the sunlight, and Virginia found herself enjoying the journey despite her uncertain future. What will you do first when we reach town? Mason asked as they rode. Virginia considered. Find work, I suppose, somewhere to stay. The Grand Imperial Hotel usually needs chambermaids. Pay isn't great, but they provide room and board. That sounds promising. Virginia hesitated. And you, what will you do? Mason adjusted his hat against the sun. Visit the sheriff's office, see if they need deputies. If not, there are several ranches nearby always looking for experienced hands. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, until Virginia asked the question that had been on her mind since the tavern. Why did you really help me, Mason? The truth. He didn't answer immediately, seeming to weigh his words carefully. 5 years ago, I was tracking a man who'd robbed a bank in Pueblo. Trail led me to a small mining town in the mountains. While I was there, I witnessed something I'll never forget. His voice grew quieter. A young woman, couldn't have been more than 17, being sold to pay her father's gambling debts. Local sheriff wouldn't intervene, said it was a private business matter. Virginia tightened her hold around his waist instinctively. What happened to her? I tried to help. Offered to pay the debt. His jaw tightened, but I was too late. They'd already taken her to the mining camp by the time I found her. He shook his head. Some things you can't undo. I'm sorry, Virginia whispered. When I saw Harlow with you, it was like seeing that girl all over again. I couldn't stand by and let history repeat itself. He glanced over his shoulder at her. But that's not the only reason. There was something about you, your dignity, even in that terrible situation. Your courage. Virginia rested her forehead briefly against his back, moved by his honesty. Thank you for telling me. They crested a hill in late afternoon, and below them stretched a valley with a growing town nestled alongside a river. Durango, Mason announced. End of the line. The town was larger than Virginia had expected, a proper street grid with several brick buildings among the wooden structures, the gleaming railroad tracks cutting through the center. Smoke rose from the smelter at the edge of town, and horses and wagons moved along the main street. It's bigger than I imagined, Virginia said as they descended toward the town. Growing every day, the silver mines in Silverton ship their ore here for processing. Mason guided his horse down the hillside. That means money flowing through town and plenty of work for those willing to do it. They rode down the main street as the setting sun cast long shadows. Virginia noticed people looking at them with curiosity, a dusty bounty hunter, and a young woman riding double certainly made an unusual sight. Mason stopped outside the Grand Imperial Hotel, an impressive 3-story brick building that dominated the corner of Main Avenue. He helped Virginia dismount, her legs stiff from the long ride. Wait here, he said. I'll inquire about work for you. Virginia smoothed her dress nervously, suddenly aware of her travel-worn appearance. What if they turned her away? What would she do then? Mason returned quickly, a slight smile on his face. They need help in the kitchen and with housekeeping. The manager's willing to meet you. He hesitated. I told her you're my sister, newly widowed, looking for a fresh start. Thought that might be easier than explaining the truth." "Quick thinking," Virginia said gratefully. "Thank you." The hotel manager, Mrs. Pendleton, was a stern-faced woman with kind eyes. She asked Virginia a few questions about her experience with cooking and cleaning, then nodded briskly. "We can offer room and board plus $3 a week. You'll share quarters with 2 other girls. Work starts at 5 in the morning, ends when the dinner service is completed. Sundays off unless there's a special event. Acceptable?" Virginia nodded quickly. "Yes, madam, very acceptable. When would I start?" "Tomorrow morning. Agnes will show you your duties." Mrs. Pendleton glanced at Mason. "Your brother is welcome to take supper with us this evening before he goes." Outside the manager's office, Virginia turned to Mason, relief evident in her face. "I can't believe it was that simple." "Durango's a town of new beginnings," Mason replied. "People don't ask too many questions about where you came from, only what you aim to do now you're here." They walked to the hotel dining room, where Mason insisted on buying Virginia a proper meal to celebrate her new position. As they ate, Virginia realized their journey was ending. Tomorrow, she would begin her new life, and Mason would go his own way. The thought left her with an unexpected hollowness. "Will you stay in Durango?" she asked. "For a while, at least." Mason cut into his steak. "I'll check with the sheriff tomorrow, see what opportunities are available." "I hope you find something suitable." Mason studied her face. "You'll do well here, Virginia. You're stronger than you know." After dinner, Mason retrieved her carpetbag from his horse. "I should let you settle in. Your roommates will probably have advice about working here." They stood awkwardly in the hotel lobby, neither seeming eager to say goodbye. "I don't know how to thank you," Virginia finally said. "What you did for me." "No thanks necessary." Mason shifted his weight. "Perhaps I could call on you Sunday, show you around town properly." Virginia felt warmth spread through her chest. "I'd like that very much." "Until Sunday, then." Mason tipped his hat and turned to leave, but Virginia caught his arm. "Mason," she said softly, "if you hadn't been in that tavern." He covered her hand with his. "But I was. And now you're here safe with work and shelter." His blue eyes held hers. "Make the most of it, that's all I ask." With that, he left, his tall figure disappearing into the twilight. Virginia watched until he was gone, then turned toward her new life, carpetbag in hand, heart lighter than it had been in years. True to his word, Mason appeared at the hotel on Sunday morning, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt. Virginia had worked hard all week, learning the hotel's routines and making herself valuable to Mrs. Pendleton. Her roommates, Agnes and Betsy, were friendly young women who'd welcomed her without prying questions. "You look well," Mason said when she met him in the lobby. "How is the work?" "Demanding but fair," Virginia replied. "Mrs. Pendleton seems pleased with me. And you?" "Did you speak with the sheriff?" Mason nodded, offering his arm as they stepped outside. "Starting tomorrow, I'm Durango's newest deputy. Sheriff Henderson needed someone with tracking experience." "That's wonderful." Virginia's smile was genuine. "It suits you better than bounty hunting, I think." They spent the day exploring Durango, from the bustling railroad depot to the quieter residential streets. Mason showed her the sheriff's office, a small brick building with iron bars on the windows, and the boarding house where he'd taken a room. As weeks passed, their Sunday outings became a cherished ritual. Virginia settled into her work at the hotel, earning a reputation for reliability and skill in the kitchen. Mason proved himself a capable deputy, respected for his fair treatment of everyone from wealthy mine owners to drunken cowboys. With each passing Sunday, their connection deepened. Mason told Virginia stories from his past that he'd never shared with anyone. Virginia confided her hopes and fears for the future. Slowly, tentatively, they began to envision a future that included each other. 3 months after their arrival in Durango, Mason invited Virginia to supper at the town's finest restaurant. She wore a new dress, purchased with her carefully saved wages, a deep green that complemented her auburn hair. "You look beautiful," Mason said when he collected her from the hotel. "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "You're quite handsome yourself." At the restaurant, they were seated at a corner table with a view of the street. After they ordered, Mason reached into his pocket and placed a small object on the table between them. "I had something made for you," he said. Virginia picked up the silver pendant, admiring the delicate engraving of mountains and a sunrise. "It's beautiful." "Open it," Mason urged. Inside was a tiny scrap of paper. Virginia unfolded it carefully, recognizing it as a fragment of the contract her brother had signed, selling her to Harlow. Across it, Mason had written in bold letters, "Never again." Virginia's eyes welled with tears. "You kept this all this time, as a reminder of the day my life changed." Mason took her hands in his. "Virginia, I never expected to find someone like you. Someone brave enough to build a new life from nothing, kind enough to forgive the past, strong enough to face whatever comes." Virginia squeezed his hands. "I was just thinking the same about you." "I know it's only been a few months," Mason continued, "but I've never been more certain of anything. I love you, Virginia Cole. Would you consider becoming Virginia Quinn?" Joy bubbled up inside her, and Virginia laughed through her tears. "Nothing would make me happier." They married 2 weeks later in Durango's small church. Mrs. Pendleton gave the bride away, and the sheriff stood as Mason's best man. Virginia wore a simple white dress with her silver pendant, and Mason couldn't take his eyes off her throughout the ceremony. Their first home was a small cabin on the outskirts of town, close enough for both to reach their work easily. In the evenings, they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Did you ever imagine this?" Virginia asked one evening, her head resting on Mason's shoulder. "When you paid my brother's debt, did you think we'd end up here?" "Honestly, no," Mason admitted. "I just knew I couldn't let Harlow take you." "My hero," she teased gently. "You saved yourself, Virginia. I just gave you a chance." She shook her head. "We saved each other. You were as lost as I was in your own way." Mason couldn't deny it. The restlessness that had driven him for years had finally settled. With Virginia, he'd found home. A year after they arrived in Durango, their family grew with the birth of their daughter, Hope. 2 years later, they welcomed a son, Daniel. Mason continued as deputy, eventually becoming sheriff when Henderson retired. Virginia managed the household and started a small bakery business that quickly became popular in town. 5 years to the day after Mason had intervened in the Broken Spoke Tavern, a letter arrived addressed to Virginia. The return address was from a small town in Wyoming Territory. The letter was brief. "Virginia, I heard you're in Durango, married with children. I'm sober now, 2 years clean. Working as a blacksmith's assistant, not asking forgiveness, just wanted you to know I think of you often and I'm glad you found happiness. Emmett." Virginia read it twice, then handed it to Mason without comment. He read it silently, then looked at her questioningly. "Will you write back?" he asked. Virginia gazed out at their garden where Hope and Daniel were playing. "Not yet," she said finally. "Maybe someday." Mason nodded, understanding. "No rush, we have time." "Yes," Virginia agreed, slipping her hand into his. "We have all the time in the world," and they did. In a land where second chances were rare and happy endings rarer still, Virginia and Mason had forged something precious from the darkest of beginnings. Her brother had sold her for a debt, But a cowboy had paid the price and led her to a new life, one richer and more fulfilling than either of them could have imagined that fateful day at the crossroads.